It's called Pet a Cat When You Encounter One on the Street. And it's the most personal chapter in the book. It's a lot about my daughter. And my daughter was very ill when she was a kid, but particularly when she was a teenager. She had a very terrible time of it. She had juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, and when she was between the ages of 14 and 16, it first destroyed her hip, which had to be replaced, and then it destroyed the ankle on her other leg, which had to be replaced. And she walked around for 2 years on broken legs, and she was taking massive doses of opiates and could hardly stay awake. And she had this advanced autoimmune disease, which produced all sorts of other symptoms that were just as bad as the joint degeneration, but which are harder to describe. And so it's just bloody brutal. And as a test of your faith, there's almost nothing that's more direct than a serious illness inflicted upon an innocent child, right? And so the chapter's a meditation on that, and also on, what to do in a situation like that, because everyone is going to have a situation like that in some sense, because you'll be faced with illness in the people that you love and in crisis. And so it's a practical guide to coping with those sorts of things. And one of the things you do when you're overwhelmed by crisis is you shorten your time frame. It's like you can't think about next month. Maybe you can't even bloody well think about next week, or maybe not even tomorrow. Because now is just so overwhelming that that's all there is. It's like, and that's what you do. You cut your time frame back until you can cope with it. And if it's not the next week that you see how to get through, then it's the next day. And if it's not the next day, then it's the next hour. And if it's not the next hour, then it's the next minute. And people are very, 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 very tough. And it turns out that if you face things that you can put up with a lot more than you think you can put up with, and you can do it without becoming corrupted. And she did recover quite fully, and much as a consequence of her own machinations, because she figured out what was wrong with her and then took the necessary steps to fix it, which is nothing short of a bloody miracle as far as I'm concerned. And anyways, part of the cat bit is, I actually start by talking about our dog, who actually died about a year ago, but he's still alive in the book. I let people know, because dog lovers love dogs, and if you love cats, then they think you don't like dogs, and then they think they don't like you. So I also point out at the beginning of the chapter that, if you want to pet a dog on the street, that's okay too, so you don't have to get up in arms about it. But the idea is that, you have to be alert when you're suffering. You have to be alert to the beauty in life, the unexpected beauty in life. And that's kind of what I was trying to get across with the idea of the cat. There's this cat that lives across the street from us called Ginger, and Ginger's a Siamese cat. And cats really aren't domesticated, technically speaking. They're still wild animals, but they kind of like people. God only knows why, but they do, And so Ginger will come wandering over, and our dog looks at her, but they're friends, and she rolls over on his back, and Seiko used to, nose her a bit. And then she'd kind of mosey over and let you pet her if she was feeling like it that day. And, you have to look for that little bit of sparkling crystal in the darkness when things are bad. You have to look and see where things are still beautiful and where there's still something that's sustaining. And, you narrow your time frame and you be grateful for what you have, and that can get you through some very dark times, and maybe even successfully if you're lucky. But even if unsuccessfully, then maybe it's only tragic and not absolute hell. And you can do that, in the worst situation. You can make it only tragic and not hell. And there's a big gap between tragedy and hell. There's nothing worse at a deathbed than to see the people there fighting. The death is bad enough, but you can take that, as terrible as it is, and make it into something that's absolutely unbearable. And maybe I think, and this is sort of what I closed the book with, is this idea is that if we didn't all attempt to make terrible things even worse than they are, then maybe we could tolerate the terrible things that we have to put up with in order to exist. And maybe we could make the world into a better place, And it's what we should be doing and what we could be doing, because we don't have anything better to do. And that's what the book is about. And Friedman noted that the books in the Old Testament were written by a lot of different people at very different times. And then they were sequenced by other people for reasons that we don't exactly understand. But there's still an underlying narrative. There's multiple underlying narrative unities
despite the fact of that rather arbitrary sequencing. And that's a strange thing. You know, I guess you could say, if you had a collection of ancient books and you were trying to put them together, you'd try to put them together in some way that made sense, right? And it wouldn't make sense unless you stumbled across some kind of underlying narrative that allowed you to order them. And so it's not entirely surprising that they're ordered in a manner that's comprehensible. But Friedman's comments on the underlying narrative structure, part of it was, well, we'll go through this. The books of the Old Testament were composed by a great many authors according to both traditional religious views and modern critical scholarship. The phenomenon of the diminishing apparent presence of God across so many stories, through so many books, by so many authors, spread over so many centuries, is consistent enough to be striking, impressive, and ultimately mysterious. But the hiding of the divine face is only half the story. There's another development also extending across the course of the entire narrative of the Hebrew Bible, which we must see before we can appreciate the full force of this phenomena, and before we can pose a solution to the mystery of how this happened. Gradually, from Genesis to Ezra and Esther, there is a transition from divine to human responsibility for life on earth. The story begins in Genesis with God in complete control of the creation, but by the end, humans have arrived at a stage at which, in all apparent ways, they have responsibility for the fate of the world. The first two human beings, Adam and Eve, take little responsibility themselves. They do not design or build anything. When they're embarrassed over their nudity, they do not make clothes. They cover themselves with leaves. It's God who makes their first clothing for them. Noah, by no means a fully developed personality, Noah is not an everyman either. Broadly speaking, he reflects a step beyond Adam and Eve in human character and responsibility. Abraham, beyond the accounts of divine commands that Abraham does carry out, the narrative also includes a variety of stories in which Abraham acts on his own initiative. He divides land with his nephew Lot. He battles kings. He takes concubines. He argues with his wife Sarah. On 2 occasions, he tells kings that Sarah is his sister out of fear that they will kill him to get his wife. And he arranges his son's marriage. In the place of the single story of Noah's drunkenness, there are, in the case of Abraham, the stories of a man's life. The Abraham section thus develops the personality and character of man to a new degree in biblical narrative, while picturing in him a new degree of responsibility. It is not just that Abraham is kinder, gentler, more intrepid, more ethical, or a better debater than his ancestor Noah. Rather, both the Noah and the Abraham stories are pieces of a development of an increasingly stronger stance of humans relative to the deity. Before the story is over, humans will become a great deal stronger and bolder than Abraham. I don't know what that means, you know. See, it is certainly the case that the individual exists in the modern world, the differentiated, self-aware, self-conscious individual. And it's certainly the case that that wasn't the case at some point in the past. And so it's the case that there's been a development, I don't know if you could call it a progression, but a development of the autonomous individual over some span of historical time. Now, we don't know how long that's been, but my suspicions are it hasn't been that long. I mean, I read once about a Neolithic ceremony that involved the particular placement of a bear skull in a cave. And then I read that, and they had found these placements in caves that were at least 25,000 years old. And then I read that they found caves in Japan among the Ainu, who were the indigenous inhabitants of Japanese territory and rather archaic people, who had the same ceremony with the bear and that put the skull in the same orientation and place in caves, and that tradition remained unbroken for about 25,000 years. And you think, well, is it possible for an oral or ritual tradition to remain unbroken for spans of tens of thousands of years? And the answer to that is not only is it possible, it's actually the norm. Because like one chimpanzee is like the next chimpanzee, right? In the progression, in the biological progression. If you took a chimpanzee troop now and you went back 25,000 years and you looked at a chimpanzee troop, it'd be the same thing. There's no historical progression. That's how you can tell that chimps really don't have culture. Because if they could even accrete 1/1000th of a percent of culture, transmissible culture per generation, It wouldn't take more than about 1 million years before they'd have a whole civilization. And they don't. They're the same as they were. And so the continuity, the stability, and unchanging nature of a species, essentially speaking, is the rule. That the variant is us. It's like, what the hell happened after the last ice age? 15,000 years ago. We went from tribal, uniform, stable to whatever the hell we are now. It's this transition from generic to specific. It's something like that. And I can't help but think that that's reflected in this text, and that it has something to do with this transition of consciousness from what? From possession by the generic divine to dominance by the specific individual. It's something like that. Is that a neurological transformation? Is that what this is a record of? I mean, we don't know. One of the things Jung said about God, because Jung's relationship with God as an object of belief is very complex. In his technical writing, he always talks about the image of God. He never talks about God. He talks about the image of God. He said that the image of God dwells within. That's not the same thing as God dwelling within, right? So all of these capacities that we have for transcendent consciousness could be a byproduct of biological evolution. They can have no reflection. They can have no relationship whatsoever to an actual transcendent reality. There's no way of telling. The transcendent reality seems to manifest itself as an element of experience, but that doesn't mean that it has a reality outside of the subjective, even if it exists, as it clearly does. But Friedman suggests that what's happening in the biblical narrative is the sequential emergence of the individual as a redemptive force, and that the Old Testament documents that implicitly, unconsciously, as a consequence of descriptive fantasy, and that that's what's going on in the book. And that, so the cosmos is under the control of generic deity to begin with, something like that. And then that control shifts to localized, identifiable, increasingly personal and detailed individuals. And you see that in Noah, and then you see it in Abraham, and then you see it in Moses. And then there's this working out of what it would mean to be a fully developed individual. And that's what these stories, they're like prototypes. They're attempts to bring about the proper mode of being, right? And so Abraham is a manifestation of that, because he enters into a covenant with God. He's selected by God, or enters into a partnership with God. It's not exactly obvious. God provides him with forward motion and intuition, and leads him towards a successful mode of being. And it's complex, successful mode of being, because Abraham has a very complex life. There's plenty of ups and downs, right? It's not unbroken purity of being towards a divine end. Abraham lies and cheats and deceives and does all sorts of things that a real person would do. And Moses, for example, kills someone. And so these people, the biblical people, are very genuine individuals, but they're given, with all their faults, right, with all their sins, with all their deceit, they're still put forth as potential modes of proper, models of potential proper being in the world. And the entire corpus of the Bible seems to be nothing but an attempt to keep throwing up variants of the personality, trying to experiment to find out what personality works in the world. The second thing is what the story, the creation stories in Genesis, for example, actually mean, because they actually mean something, and what they mean is absolutely remarkable in my estimation. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about that story, because it's necessary to understand what the story means to determine if what Nietzsche said about the inevitable destruction of our symbolic religious structures by science was inevitable and necessary. And I think the answer to that is no. We just didn't understand what the hell we were doing, any more than we really understand why we put up Christmas trees at Christmas. So we do that in part because the Christmas tree is a symbol of life, because the tree is a symbol of life, because we inhabited trees for untold millions of years, and we put lights on the trees to symbolize the coming back into the darkness of midwinter of the sun and the light. And so we play this symbolic game that celebrates both life and the emergence of light and consciousness, and we associate that with the birth of the Savior. But we don't know that we're doing that. But we do it anyways. And we do that sort of thing all the time because we're smarter than we know. And that has to be the case because we don't know ourselves. We wouldn't need a psychology or sociology or an anthropology or any of those things if we were transparent to ourselves. We're machines, so to speak, that are far more intelligent and wise than the machines themselves can understand. And we reveal ourselves to ourselves in our action and our symbolic gestures constantly, and then have to reflect on that to try to understand what it is that we're up to. I read a very interesting book a while back called The Wealth and Poverty of Nations that was written by a Harvard emeritus professor of history. And one of the things that he claimed, and I liked it, I thought it was very smart, was that the only true natural resource is interpersonal trust. If you can set up a society where people trust each other, then it will instantly become rich. And he used the example of Japan, which is a very conscientious society and very rich society, but the Japanese have no natural resources, right? None to speak of. And yet they're rich. And then you have countries like the Soviet Russia and much of South America where there's just natural resources that, you know, they're just like Venezuela. It's just more natural resources than you know what to do with. And the places are absolute catastrophes of cynicism and corruption. And so he attempted to document the relationship between default interpersonal trust among citizens within countries and their productivity and their GDP and their standard of living, and found a very, very tight relationship. And I like that a lot, and I've got a story about that quickly that I think is very interesting. I'll tell you two stories, one sort of generic. Well, I'll tell you one personal first. So one day, I lent my car to one of my graduate students, and he took it to Montreal. It was this old Cadillac. And it was a really bad rainstorm in Montreal, and he was in one of the highways that are like set into the ground, and there was like 6 inches of water, and he was turning a corner and hit the brakes and skidded on the water and smacked it into the wall and on the corner of the bumper, you know. And so then he brought it back, and he was very apologetic about it, and his name was Matt Shane. I'll tell you that because Matt might hear this, and I can shame him a bit for doing this 20 years ago, you know. And he's a professor at the Ontario Institute of Technology, I think now, and quite a successful one. But anyways, he brought the car back, and I went and got it evaluated for damages. It was like $1,700 or something to repair it, or maybe more. But it was almost as much as the car was worth. And I thought, well, I'm not going to do that. So I went online and I typed in the part, and if you do that, you can get people to bid on sending you a used part from all over North America. So that's kind of cool. So there's all these junk dealers have got together, and they have this, you know, network of communication. So you put in the car part, and then they send you a bid. And so this guy said, well, I'll send you the bumper assembly, which is the whole bumper and the lights, for like $250. And I thought, yeah, okay, you could do that. That'd be good. So then I said yes, and then he called me up. About half an hour later, this guy from way down south, he had a really deep sort of Mississippi accent, and he said, wait a sec, was that for the bumper or the bumper assembly? And I said, well, it was for the bumper assembly. He said, oh, I thought it was for the bumper. And then he said, but that's okay, I'll send it to you anyways. I thought, well, that's pretty good. So I said, well, thank you, and then I hung up, and then half an hour later, he called me up again, and he said, look, I just went out and looked at that bumper assembly, and there's a plastic trim piece on the side, and it has a scratch in it, and I thought I better tell you that just in case you didn't want it. And I thought, wow, that's so amazing. It's like, there's a miracle, man. It's like this guy, he's somewhere in Mississippi. I'm never going to see him again, ever. I'm never going to have any contact with him. Like, he made a bad deal, right? Because the part was worth more than he decided to sell it to me for. But he stuck with this deal. And then he went over and above the call of duty. He said, well, this part that I'm selling to you for way less than it's worth is damaged. So I thought I better tell you. It's like, man, you got to recognize a miracle when you see one. That was a miracle. So I said, hey, look, thanks for calling, man. It's okay, I can handle the scratch, send the part. And he did, and I got the car fixed and forgave Matt, and, you know, it had a happy ending. So that's trust, right? Because I didn't know him from Adam, and he's a primate full of snakes just like the rest of us. And yet he was willing to simplify himself to the point where I could just take him absolutely at his word. And that meant we could trade even though we were strangers. It's like, man, do not underestimate the utility of that. And then there's eBay. So when eBay first started, you know, The idea was, it's not going to work, because you'll send me junk and I'll send you a check that bounces, and that'll be the end of eBay, right? And so these escrow agents popped up so you could insure your transaction with them. It was for like 10% of the transaction. They would get the check and the goods and make sure that they were okay, and then send them on or insure the transaction. But what happened was the escrow agents didn't make any money. And the reason for that was no one cheated. Now you think about how amazing that is, right? You bring these people together across a whole continent. They've never seen each other before. They're never going to interact with each other again. And this was before there were any reputation ratings on eBay. And yet the default transaction was, you describe your goods honestly, including their flaws. You set a reasonable price. I decide to pay you. You ship the goods, and I pay you. And it works. And what happened was that eBay produced a tremendous amount of capital that was previously frozen. So frozen capital is when you've invested money in something, but the thing is no longer useful to you, so the money is just sitting there frozen, right, so to speak. And you can't get it loose because, well, you've got an attic full of junk. How are you going to get rid of that? Oh, eBay. And so all of a sudden all these things that were just junk became valuable, and everybody got richer. And none of that would have happened without the covenant that we established between each other that's predicated on trust. And so you might say that trust is the currency. And currency is trust because it's a promissory note, right? And if people lie, then the currency gets debased very, very rapidly. And so the economy runs on trust. Serve tradition. Serve the father. Psychologically speaking, support the tradition because you live on it. There, in an old Mesopotamian story, the Enuma Elish, which you can read about if you're interested in, the original gods, who are really badly behaved, they're like 2-year-olds. In fact, they're a lot like 2-year-olds. They kill the primordial god, Apsu, who's the patriarchal god. They kill him and try to live on his corpse. Well, that's what we all do, right? Because we live on the corpse of our ancestors. You could say we live on the corpse of our culture. It's dead. And that's not a great place to live, so you have to keep revivifying it so the damn thing, stays active and awake. You stay on the corpse for too long, and then the devil or the demon of chaos comes back, and that's what happens in the Mesopotamian story. It's like, don't be thinking that you can stay on the corpse of your ancestors for too long without contributing to the revivification of the system. Because the chaos that all of that holds at bay will definitely come and visit you. And you see that in stories like The Hobbit. Hobbits, they're nice, they like to eat, they're kind of fat, they're short, they're not very bright, they're hubristic. They have no idea what's out there in the broader world. They're protected, if you remember, by the Striders, who are the sons of great kings, who look like tramps. They have nothing but contempt for them. They patrol the borders and keep the bloody hobbits safe. But out there in the periphery, all hell is brewing and chaos is generating and forming. And that's an archetypal story, and that's why people like that story so much, because that's exactly right. Like, we're the hobbits, and we are protected from chaos by the spirits of our dead ancestors, and we're too damn stupid to know it. And we think, oh, well, we don't need them anymore. And that, to me, that's postmodernism. That's what the bloody universities are doing with the humanities. It's absolutely appalling. And we will pay for it. So, unless we wake up, and hopefully we'll wake up, because that would be better than paying for it, even though being awake is rather painful. And if I read philosophy, I tend not to read second-rate philosophy, and so I've tried to avoid the postmodernists to some degree, because their incoherency is one of the least of their sins, but they don't care about that. No, you've got to understand, man. It's modernists and Enlightenment people and even traditionalists who care about coherency. The postmodernists don't believe in coherency. They don't believe in, and I'm not making this up, this is part of their philosophy. They don't believe in logic. Derrida says straight out that Western society is phallo-logocentric, by which he means male-centered and privileging the idea of logic. Well, he doesn't buy any of that. He doesn't think that there's a truth that's out there. He doesn't believe that individuals can reach any sort of truth by thinking. He certainly doesn't believe that we can move towards truth in dialogue, because that's dialogic, right? There's none of that. You wonder, well, why do the postmodern types keep other thinkers off the campus? Well, it's not because they're afraid. Well, although some of them are, but they use their fragility as a mask for their, the underlying philosophical and political interests. They do that fragmentarily. It's not like every social justice warrior is a,
sword-carrying postmodernists, but the ideas are fragmented and distributed among them like they're distributed among a mob. And if you put the whole mob together, you get the whole postmodernist thing happening at the same time, and that's how ideas have people instead of the other way around. Anyways, forget about logic. That's out the window. That's just a construct of Western society, and the whole point of the construct was to oppress other people and to take their wealth and to privilege the people who live within that so-called logic system so that they can justify to themselves and other people their predator rapaciousness, straight and simple. And that's partly because postmodernism was influenced by Marxism, and of course that's what the Marxists think about any situation where there's a, let's call it a power status differential. The people at the top are only there because they've stole everything from the people at the bottom.